Welcome back to Stormi Talks True Crime on my Girls Rock Productions channel. This week's crime is a pretty heinous one, and there isn't any question behind who did it, like the first two. I will be talking about a woman who won't be winning any awards for Mother of the Year anytime soon, Mitchelle Blair. Now, I will have to give a disclaimer because this case will involve severe child abuse. If that is not something you want to hear about, just tune in for next week's video. Before we dig into the crimes of the Freezer Mom, I want to look a little into her background and try to figure out where she became so evil. Mitchelle Blair was born February 14, 1982 in Detroit, Michigan, and her early life was fraught in challenges that would later manifest in her disturbing behavior. Her descent into infamy can be traced back to a tumultuous upbringing. Reports indicate that she faced significant hardships, including poverty and abuse, during her formative years. These experiences likely contributed to her inability to provide a stable environment for her own children. Blair grew up in a broken home rife with violence and instability. This can have a profound effect on a child's development, often leading to cycles of abuse and neglect. Many experts believe that her traumatic experiences may have influenced her decision-making skills as a parent. Mitchell would go on to have 4 children by 2 different fathers. Her oldest daughter, Gabby Blair, would later state in interviews that Mitchell was abusive to her boyfriends at first, but once they left, the abuse would soon turn to her children. To the outside world, she would pretend to be a loving and doting mother, but behind closed doors was a very different story. Gabby would talk about how her mother would go through phases where she would beat them with electrical cords for a period and then switch to belt buckles. She even reports being forced to sit in wall sits for hours and being burned by curling irons. For those of you who don't know what wall sits are, that is when you put your back, shoulders, and hips up against the wall and then slide down to where you are. It is like you are sitting in an invisible chair. It becomes excruciatingly painful after several minutes, so hours would have been horrible. Gabby also would talk about how her mother would barely give them enough food to eat and yell at them or beat them if they asked for seconds. She would often give her younger siblings the rest of her portion as soon as her mother would leave to go out partying for the night. Mitchelle would never take the children to the doctors or dentists, in fear that they would notice the bruises and notify authorities. One day she hit Gabby so hard in the mouth that it chipped one of her front teeth. She would then force Gabby to lie to her great aunt, telling her that she didn't want to go to the dentist to have it fixed because it made her look unique. Eventually, she took the kids out of school because she didn't want the teachers to see the bruises and report it. One day, in August 2012, Blair finally took the abuse too far. After seeing her youngest son playing with some toys and putting them in a suggestive position, she exploded. She became obsessed with this crazy notion that the older siblings had been sexually assaulting the youngest brother, and she started interrogating him. She would repeatedly ask the young boy if Stephen, the older brother Stephen Gage Barry, had done something to him. The little boy denied anything happened, but eventually he told her yes. Now, as a side note here, there has never been any concrete evidence to prove that the youngest son had ever been sexually assaulted. The younger brother was just simply scared of his mother and didn't know any better. After getting her son to admit to the abuse, Blair left the room and returned with an extension cord, which she wrapped around Stephen's neck and lifted him up off the ground with it. She then carried him into the bedroom and while still strangling him and closed the door. Over the next couple of weeks, according to Gabby, Blair would deny Stephen food, asphyxiate him with a plastic bag, and torture him. She would admit in court that she forced him to drink Windex and poured boiling water on his genitals, which led to the skin falling off. The boy would eventually die from his injuries at only 9 years old on August 20th, 2012. Gabby says that she remembers her mother saying before he died that she thought he had been punished enough, but when she finally let him out of her bedroom, Stephen took a turn for the worse. Then the 17-year-old walked into a room to see her mother holding her younger brother and crying over him. She told Gabby to say her goodbyes to Stephen and tell him she loved him. Gabby said her goodbyes and watched as Stephen took his final breath. Then, Mitchelle would do the unthinkable. In a panic, she came up with an idea to hide her son's body. She wrapped him up in a blanket and forced her teenage daughter to hide his body in the deep freezer they had in the apartment. Over the next few months, when anyone would ask about Stephen, she would give excuses as to where he was. She would even threaten her other children if they said anything about what actually had happened. She even made them practice where they were to say if anyone asked about his absence, and since the kids weren't in school, no one would ever report him missing. Eventually, Blair's paranoia and bloodlust did get the best of her again. In May of 2013, Blair again becomes convinced that another one of her older children is sexually assaulting her youngest son. Again, she interrogates the little boy, threatening and telling him not to lie as he denies the assault. Finally, he again says yes, scared of his mother and not knowing any better. This time, it would be her younger daughter, Stormi Ann Blair, who would become the victim of her wrath. 13-year-old Stormi would be brutally beaten, starved, and tortured for several days. At one point, while Stormi was still barely alive, DCS was actually called to the Detroit apartment. Blair threatened the other children and hid Stormi under the bed, stating that they would all end up in the freezer if they said anything. After child services left the home, Mitchelle begins to viciously beat Stormi with a 3x4 board. She also grabs Stormi and throws her headfirst into the wall. Stormi's body goes limp, and that is when Gabby states that Mitchelle started laughing and begins to suffocate Stormi with a plastic bag. She then tells Gabby not to cry for that bitch, and then forces the 17-year-old again to help her bring the young girl's body down to the freezer. This time, however, Stormi isn't actually dead yet. So again, Blair puts the plastic bag over her head and shuts Stormi in the freezer. For almost 2 years, Mitchelle Blair gets away with the murder of 2 of her children. She would continue to threaten her other 2 children with a similar fate if they got out of line or even said anything about the whereabouts of their siblings. Then, in March of 2015, Blair was given an eviction notice after falling behind on rent. Knowing the jig was up, she brought her 2 children over to a neighbor, asking them to watch her children as she was going to be arrested for killing her other 2 children. As this was going on, court officers were making a grisly discovery in the freezer while removing her furniture. 2 bodies, originally believed to be that of a young boy and an old woman, were found stuffed inside the freezer. It wouldn't be until the autopsy was done that authorities would learn that the old woman was actually a 13-year-old girl. Gabby and the youngest brother were immediately taken into protective custody and handed over to their great aunt. Now, Mitchelle stated at one point that she wanted to turn herself in for the murders, but her youngest son didn't want to live without his mother. I personally doubt this, since she was threatening and abusing all of her children. Blair would originally be charged with 2 counts of felony murder, premeditated murder, and torture. Several months later, however, Blair, then 36, pleaded guilty to murdering her 2 children and was sentenced to life in prison without parole in June of 2015. During her sentencing hearing, Blair repeatedly stated that she felt no remorse for killing those demons. She would continue to make the non-founded claims of sexual abuse on her youngest son and her reasoning for doing what she did. In an interview in September of 2015, she continued to state that she would kill them again. "I don't care what anybody thinks. She had to go, period," Blair said. She continued on to say, "When I say he's got closure, he got it. I knew exactly what he was feeling because that's exactly how I used to feel," talking about her youngest son and the alleged sexual abuse. It was reported in March of 2017 that Mitchelle Blair accumulated as many as 28 misconducts while incarcerated, including assaulting and spitting on other prisoners. She was also accused of using cans to throw urine and feces at her corrections officers. Mitchelle also allegedly hit the officers. As a result, she was sentenced to an additional 38 months to 5 years. She is currently serving her sentences at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Pittsfield, Michigan. This story has been featured in a couple of documentaries over the last decade. I first heard about the story in Evil Lives Here on ID, which is where I got a good bit of the information in this video. There is also a Netflix documentary that I may check out in the near future, which goes more into Mitchelle's background and upbringing to try to find any warning signs of what was to come. I think the only thing that can be considered controversial about this case is if you truly believe Blair's unfounded allegations of sexual assault on the youngest boy by the two older siblings. I personally think she was just looking for any excuse to be able to take her anger out on two innocent children. And the thing she did to these two poor children was uncalled for, because I personally do not believe either of those children sexually abused their younger brother. So, this concludes the story of the Freezer Mom. Feel free to discuss your thoughts on this story in the comments below, or give suggestions on cases you may want to hear about. Remember to like the video and subscribe to my Girls Rock Productions channel while you're here, check out some of my other playlists. On Stormi Teaches Music, I do live covers and guitar lessons on Mondays and Wednesdays at 11 p.m. Eastern. I do the live covers on Mondays and the lessons for the song I covered on Wednesdays. On Stormi Talks Ghost Stories, I talk about different haunted cities each month and tell true ghost stories out of those cities. Those videos are posted Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. Don't forget to tune in next Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern for next week's video on Stormi Talks True Crime. Until then, have a great week and stay safe.